Welcome back to the One Thing podcast, where we talk about the surprisingly simple truth behind extraordinary results. And we have a very special guest today, the co author himself, Jay Papasan. And he knows I have been so excited to do this podcast, to have this conversation, because I think it's a really important one. And as we have so many entrepreneurs and so many business owners and executives and people who have really hard jobs that listen to this podcast, I think this is going to be just such a powerful conversation for them because we're talking about some failure. Talking
Yeah.
about some challenges. We're talking about the real things, not just success, which we get to talk about a lot on this podcast, how to be successful, models for success. But we're going to approach it a little differently today. And we're going to talk about how your biggest failure is becoming a CEO.
You said it right there.
How did that happen?
Well, I came to Gary with the idea of creating ProduKtive, a training company around the one thing in 2014. And he loved it. He said, let's do it. I'm all in. We'll do it 50-50 partners, the whole thing. And then I started making plans and he goes, but wait a minute, you're not doing it. There's someone out there for whom this is the perfect opportunity. And so it took me 8 or 9 months. But then in 2015, I hired a gentleman named Jeff Woods, and a lot of people know him who know the one thing. He was our co-founder, helped us launch the business. And so the whole thing by design was that I would be as like an investor or a chairman of the board. In Keller Williams, we would call it a seventh level business from the start, where I never had the job. And so for the first 7 years, it was Jeff's job. And I was very proud of that. And I didn't know some of the cost of choosing that path or some of the risks, which I got to find out later. And that's some of the stuff we'll, in our Get Real episode, kind of walk through.
Well, the challenge with that not a lot of people talk about. I think that's the dream. People think they're going to invest some money, be an angel investor, so to speak, give a little bit of contribution, and then it's just going to go really well. And yet that's so rarely. Those are the unicorn off chances that actually happens in practice. And most people have a lot of challenge when two things happen. One, it's not them building the business themselves, or when they do build the business themselves and eventually try to get out of the business, because it's typically so focused around the founder's skill set and the founder's vision. So what happens when the founder has a vision and yet you hire someone else to execute that vision?
Well, I think Jeff and I were a great match and we were very complementary. So, like, we had to pivot like everybody. We started selling courses, and neither of us loved the vibe of just selling courses, the same courses. Like, you just kind of burn out your list. Like, we went to a community model, and that's when the business really started taking off. It's like, instead of hitting our email list with, would you like to buy this? Could we get them into a community and then just say, can we provide so much value they never want to leave? And it was just a whole different way of talking about it. But that was really the foundation of how everything started working. We launched the podcast. Gosh, what episode are we on? We're in the 450s or
I
something
was going to
now.
say, we're going to come out, this will be around 460-ish.
Holy cow. So that's like OG podcast time. And eventually Jeff, I mean, he has amazingly talented presenter. We got into corporate training. The problems show up when you are it would be kind of like long distance investing. It's fine as long as you've got a property manager, but when you have to manage it directly, do you really know where the light switches in the dark? And my challenge is that Jeff and I had been functioning so highly, and it's one of the lessons we can go into later. Like, the business had been built really very highly compatible for him, and it made sense because he was running it day to day. But when I had to step into the role in 2023, like, we really had to, and you were part of that team who joined me, had to kind of deconstruct the entire operation and rebuild it from the ground up so that I wasn't qualified to drive the old car. I was qualified to drive the new one. And so that was the trade-off. I got 7 years of growth and great outcomes from the one version without having a day job. The price of that is that you really, really have to do it a very special way to make it work and transfer leadership.
Well, and the challenge too is if you didn't build the thing, if you weren't involved in the day to day, it's virtually impossible to really understand what's going on, even if someone is great at building systems and great at articulating what everyone is doing. I think we see this a lot when people
And
purchase.
entrepreneurs are really good at systems,
Yeah,
right?
so good at systems. People who are
No.
great at sales are usually so good at systems. We laugh because we know they're not, and those are usually the people that drive growth really quickly like that. And it was fairly fast in the scheme of
Oh,
things.
yeah.
And I see this challenge come up for so many people, whether they hand it off, whether they purchase a business, that you can ask as many questions as you can think to ask. You can be really smart in how you dig into day to day, but you'll never know as much as the person who did that job. You just won't.
You stepped into the business almost a year to the day, because we started talking about it at family reunion in 2023, and the previous year, I believe, is when Jeff and I parted ways, and he ended up taking an amazing opportunity as a chief growth officer, I believe, with one of our clients. And so, like a year later, I'm still like, how well documented was the business when you stepped into it?
Not well.
Right. I mean, that is the challenge. You
Yeah.
step back into it, and there's all these moving parts, and you're trying to make sure you know how they connect and how to operate them correctly.
Well, and you're always looking at it from your frame, right? You're always looking at it, and no matter how great you are at understanding operations and asking great questions, you're always looking at it from your frame of mind. I would have done it this way, therefore, I might assume that somebody else would do it that way too, and that makes understanding it a little bit challenging.
It's one of the lessons, I think, unless you have a very generic business. I think if you're running, gosh, like, everybody's going to like immediately say, no, that's not true. I was going to say like a coffee shop or a laundromat. I think the more generic the business, the more likely it is to easily look for and find the best practice and go run it. Now, Starbucks would say, but we've got our special sauce or whatever that is. And I would agree. But I do think that this was a business that was born from mine and Gary's ideas. It was a very unique business built around our IP. And so it was also something that was like custom made, but it was custom made, like a custom made suit fit for someone else.
Right.
Right. So like now we have to re-engineer the whole thing. So that was like the biggest lesson, besides be accountable. Like when everything kind of started going downhill, you were part of the decision, the hard decision. Do we stand down these lines of revenue? Do we step back from, the corporate training? Not to say we stopped, but we're not going to give it as much focus. And that was like generating close to 2 million in revenue. Do we stand down a paid community that had 2,000 members because it wasn't hitting our value standards? Like the idea of recreating a suit is really easy. You take it apart at the seams, you measure again, and you rebuild it. But when you're standing down product lines that have existing customers, there's a cost. And so, like, just staying engaged and knowing that if this is really, I'm going to be a co founder, even the co founder has a job. And the minimum requirement is that you stay engaged enough to truly understand how the business operates and what makes it special. If you step back just too far, that's fuzzy, that can be a real challenge for you.
I want to get into some of the specific lessons, but I also want to share why specifically I was so excited to do this because I think so many people look up to you and look up to Gary and look up to other incredible executives that we've been around and I think the downside to that is that you often get sort of painted in this picture of someone who just never fails. And that success is easy for you and it always goes smoothly and it's always right and you always make the right decision. And I told you pretty candidly when we started talking about this podcast, I could have an encyclopedia of things that I've learned from you, but perhaps the thing I'm most grateful for is having the opportunity to learn from you through challenges and to watch how you've worked through them and how you've thought through them and how you've led through them and how you've explained through them and how you've used the one thing models through them because we talk so much about using the one thing models to go and achieve whatever it is that you want to achieve, which is exactly what they're designed to do. And yet sometimes people get so stuck in these models and how they apply and how we teach them that they can't think outside the box. And I'll give an example of, I was one of those people who've long since used the GPS. And in my head, it was always designed to be a 1-year business plan. And when we had to narrow the focus and narrow the product line, you said, let's not try to build a 1-year GPS and let's just build it for the quarter. And I was like, the the
Sacrilege.
blasphemy.
Yeah.
And yet here the founder is telling me this is how to do it so that we can get on track. And it did help. And it helped to narrow the focus even more. It helped to get clearer on the priorities. And I just had never
Well, it's
seen
a
it done that way
different, like
before.
we preach follow the model, but the models are there to serve us. We're not there to serve the models. So if the model in its current form isn't serving you, can you take the essence of it and change the frame so that it does serve you? And we learned this in COVID, right? Like nobody knew it was going to happen in 12 months. There were lots of
Yeah.
people claiming they did,
Yeah.
but why in the world are we trying to create a 12-month plan when we can't see that far?
Yeah. In an uncertain future.
Right. And so, like, I had a writing professor, E.L. Doctorow, and great writer. He was part of my graduate program. And we were asking, like, how do you write a whole novel? And his answer to us, like a good cryptic, writing professor, is you can drive all the way across the country at night and you only have to see as far as your headlights. And I was like, okay, I don't have to see the whole way in detail. I just need to see to the end of my headlights. And there were periods of time where we had a 3-month GPS, a quarterly GPS, and frankly, we couldn't see 30 days out. We're making changes so rapidly and so fundamentally, trying to recapture the value exchange we had with our clients. Are we delivering the value that they deserve and what is possible? And we're like, all right, let's run the test, and we'll know in 30 days whether it worked. And that's just the reality. It's almost like I think every business at some point has to completely recast itself. So we were just back in startup mode, right? Fail fast, fail often, and just improve, improve, improve.
I think a lot of people don't recognize the humility that takes, though, especially as someone who is very accomplished to say, this didn't work or this didn't work out. And by the way, I think what's important to talk about, and I think goes into one of the lessons that you already mentioned, and that the product line got a little too diversified, right? There was too many things. But that didn't happen because there wasn't a clear focus and because there wasn't a clear mission. It was really in the execution of it. Because I look at that and I say, you were so focused on delivering value to the customer, you were so focused on helping people that you just kept trying to come up with more ways to help people, right? Like what could be bad about more ways to provide more value? And it sort of backfired a little bit.
Well, that's one of the lessons, right? And it's simplify, simplify, simplify. And there's a thing called Gall's Law. My friend Tim Grahl, shout out to Tim if he's listening, taught me about this. I'd never heard of it with all the reading. And it was by a guy who studied biology, he studied physics and all these different systems. And his observation, which became a law, is that all complex systems that function well arise from simple systems that function well. And so the lesson is you got to start simple because eventually it gets complex. And I think what you saw when you stepped in, you were at 8 years. But what happens when a simple plan naturally evolves and is going well, it gets very complex. So I went to the summer of 2023. I got invited to 3 author masterminds. Donald Miller invited me down to, gosh, I'm going blank now, Nashville, gathered with a bunch of top authors. I got invited by a fellow named Mo Bennell, great guy, into Atlanta. And a guy named Stu McLaren took me to Charleston. And I'm masterminding with Amy Porterfield and Jenna Kutcher and Michael Bungay Stanier, like some amazing people, some of my idols, the people out there. And I get in this little small mastermind, and I can still remember there's like, Jay, you need to one thing your business. It's like, ah,
It's a
dang it.
tough pill to
Dang it. And
swallow.
and you know that, right? You
Yeah.
go out and you know the emperor doesn't have clothes at that moment. And here are these people asking me literally to sign their copies of the one thing. Dan
Like I
Martell,
did write this
right?
book.
Yeah, and I'm like, yeah, and then, "How many products do you have?" And and they got it, and they like it was nice that they were compassionate, but it took me 3 times hearing that from my peers to go, "Yep, it's absolutely." So you remember we came back that into that year, and we started making, with real determination, some real big changes. We're gonna change the way we operate, and we're gonna simplify, simplify, simplify.
And again, it takes people around you, it takes mentors, it takes being open to learning to be able to do that. And I think that's also sort of the curse of being a founder sometimes, and the curse of being someone who's been in the business is that you are so used to the way it's always been done. You're so used to this is how we became successful or this is how we did it or whatever, that it can be really hard to hear that. And then it can be especially hard to take action on it.
I think the way you describe it, I think Gary suffers from this far more than I do. My co-author Gary Keller, if someone's new to the podcast, the when you get put on a pedestal because you've had a certain amount of success, sometimes you're surrounded by people who are just pointing out the good that you've already done.
Yeah.
And
It's
they're
like
nervous
the
about pointing out,
rock
like,
star challenge.
your flies down, dude,
Yeah.
right? Like, but like we're all human
Yeah.
and we're all going to make mistakes. And so I think sometimes founders find themselves in small circles, and it becomes so important to make sure that you have people there that you've empowered to kind of tell you what you need to hear. And the worst, is that, how the mighty fall, go back to Jim Collins. Like when you start believing your own reviews, you're going to be in real trouble. And so I learned from the best. I mean, Gary, like, he'll tell you that building a great, big, successful business starts with a great small business. And you're just going to go through a series of walls where you hit a wall and you have to level up to a brand new model to make the breakthrough. And the reality was we were kind of stuck around 3 million in revenue. We were kind of hitting a wall. So maybe it was the universe telling us, like, you need to do something differently or you're not going to go to the next level.
I also think it's important too, because when you get used to winning or when you grow really fast, it can be hard to stomach those walls. And a lot of people then either throw in the towel or fold the business or think this isn't viable anymore. And it's usually just a sign you have to rethink things. That's really all. And yet sometimes people assign a fatal mark to it, and it's not. It just means that you have to take a step back and reorient.
A 7-year run is a great run for a business, right? And we just had to kind of, we would call it a reset in our vernacular. We had to do a reset on our goals, decide what exactly mattered, simplify, and come up with a brand new plan. And it just took a little longer than I would have hoped.
Well, talk about the evolution because you had this great run up, you had the 7-year stretch. Jeff moves on to another opportunity, and that's when you start to get back into the business a little bit more on the day to day, and you start to realize what's happening. What happened from there?
Well, I mean, I reached out to you at a certain point. I felt like I knew that we were going to be changing directions, and you start to ask the question, or do we have the right people to move in the new direction? They were all hired to do the old job, and if we're changing job descriptions, does it match? So part of it was evaluation. I'd like to give people a lot of time to try to find success, especially if I was a part of the team that gave them the old job. So a lot of it was evaluating. Like I gave an interim leader a long time to try to see if that worked, and it didn't end up working out. But you try to make sure that you manage the transition in a way that honors the people that got you where you got there. Dance with the one who brought you, and in the old Texas vernacular, and do your best to do that to honor the commitment they made to you. So there was just a big transition. You were a part of it. And it was also me trying to get really clear on what is the next stage. And that's the hardest thing, right? And one, I had to learn how does this vehicle drive? And on the road we're going on, how does it need to drive? So I had to learn a series of lessons through that evolution. The first starts with just acknowledging this ain't working. And
Yes.
that's the hard pill.
Yeah, well, awareness is the hardest pill to swallow because once you're aware of it, you then have the responsibility to decide whether you're going to do something about it or not. And it goes against everything you believe in to not do something about it. And that's the pivotal moment of we talked about accountability before we actually jumped into this, and I want you to share more about that. But that's the pivotal moment where you have to make a decision about whether you're going to be accountable to this awareness that you now have.
Well, that's the first and foremost lesson. And you heard me when we would do our accountability meetings, our 411s together. Like when I had to sometimes process things out loud, I think when things go bad or go poorly or unplanned, like we talk about it in the one thing, right? You have a choice about the mindset that you adopt. You can choose to be accountable or you can choose to be victim. And we acknowledge in the book that's a tough word. We know that there's a lot of people whose circumstances are truly dire and they are a victim of them. This is a mindset. Like, are we going to lay down and say it's their fault? Or are we going to look up and say, where's my DNA in this issue? And I've learned from the best. I've learned from you. I've learned from Gary. I've learned from other great coworkers that when you choose to be accountable for the results, even if they really feel like a stretch, let's just say this is my fault, you're actually empowering yourself to make a difference. If you're in this thing where it's circumstances or the market or those people did this to me, you're really unempowering yourself to make change. So I think the first lesson is, especially for leaders and founders, you have to own the results, period. You have to be accountable. My coach, Jordan, he can wax poetic on this. Like the first step is to adopt the accountability mindset, but that actually then becomes the bridge to the discipline it takes to form the new habits that get you where you need to go. The only way to dig out of that hole is to go from the mindset to action and saying, if it's up to me, if it's going to be, it's up to me. The accountability mindset, it's not about them, it's not about the market. Then you just pick up the shovel and you start digging.
I think that's such an important differentiation that a lot of people don't make too, because I see a lot of leaders who are accountable. They will gladly point out when they have DNA on the issue or when they cause the problem. And yet there's a whole group of them who will also do nothing about it. And action is the differentiation here. And it's not true accountability if you're not behaving on what you need to do.
I'm hearing my mom in my head. You said you're sorry, but what are you going to do differently?
Right.
Right? Like the difference between being sorry and like, is it remorse? I can't remember the language she used back then. But she's like, yes, you can be sorry, but now you have to change the behavior. And that's the lesson. And I know that we see people, and I don't want to say that people are that or the other, because I think we can slide into and out of
Of
the
course.
accountability mindset. It
Of
really depends
course.
on maybe the day or the terrain we're in. Because I struggled with it for a while, but the beginning of things getting better always begins with saying, it's ultimately I have to choose to be accountable for this, that my DNA is in here somewhere, and therefore I have the ability to change my circumstances. Um, if we're going through the lessons, the second one is like, I mean, the phenomenal one is the high cost of poor selection. Right now, I inherited a crew, and I'm not going to say any of them was a bad hire. That's the wrong way. But if they were poorly suited to a position, the higher up that happens, the more costly it can be. You've taken our hiring course. Like one of the things when we're trying to get people's attention so they don't just go out there and get the first warm body and throw them into their business and say, I hired someone, I've got a salesperson now.
Which
Or,
happens when you're dying as an entrepreneur
yeah,
more than people would think. You can breathe and do anything. Yes, you got the job.
we call it hiring from pain. You've gotten so far into this place, you just need help. You don't really, you're not really being very discerning. You're not selecting. But the more empowered or the more powerful that person is as a leader, they have more jurisdiction in your business, however you want to put it, the more costly it is. And so I did the exercise. I just went back to our old Recruit Select, looked up the exercise, and I just started doing the work. And this was me kind of, I don't know, rubbing salt in my own wounds. But I was like, how do I move from the mindset to action?
How
I've
do I
got
make
to
sure this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, I've got to measure the cost. And I'll just share with you, very conservatively, it runs into easily the low seven figures. And that's the thing when you add up, the actual salaries and then the turnover, the change management, the lost opportunity. You add it up and you're like, oh, this was $1 million mistake. And so, like, I don't know how you feel about losing $1 million of
It's not
opportunity.
good, Jay. I'll
Yeah.
tell you that it's not good.
Yeah, like pass out the barf bags right now. But it's very motivating in the sense of that's not gonna happen again. I'm gonna make that commitment. If it happens, it's gonna happen very differently. It'll be a new lesson to learn, but I've learned this lesson. I don't need to relearn this lesson ever again in my life. And that's why you do it, right? So the high cost of poor selection, and I say selection because who hired who? Who hired who? That is always on you, the leader. It's always on you, the founder. You brought them into your business and you owe them an apology if they were a poor selection, right? Because they could be awesome somewhere else.
The person who's not right for the position doesn't make them a bad person.
Heck no. They can be
And
extraordinary talent, but you put them on the wrong seat. So again, go back to that language. Um, Three, move faster. It's the third lesson.
curious.
So I am not the fastest person out there, not compared to you, not compared to Gary. I like to think things through and then act fast. Um, I was sitting there pondering whether I could make a square peg fit in a round hole. Like, what are all the ways I could make that happen? And I read Cody Sanchez, our mutual friend. We got to interview her. Um, she wrote in an essay about a guy who had gotten advice from his billionaire founder. And he was talking about needing to replace a restaurant manager that he knew wasn't right, but was putting it off because he didn't want the job back. That's the problem. Like, if it's high
Small
enough
team,
up,
small
like you're getting the
founder.
job back, which is one of the reasons we wait and we dilly dally. And the founder just asked him, if you were running a marathon and you had a rock in your shoe, wouldn't you stop and take it out? And I texted Cody right there on the couch. I can still remember it. And I just said, that was like more than a gut punch. That was kind of like a nut punch. I mean, that was a low blow.
Yeah.
I was
I'm not
like,
feeling
why are
great
you
right
writing
now.
this newsletter and sending it right to me? And it was just like, that was when I made the decision. I was like, I have to step back in as CEO. I can't keep delegating what's ultimately going to be my responsibility to fix things and asking people to do things that, like, whether they're capable or not, I'm putting them in a position where they're not likely to succeed. So it's got to be me. So move faster, right? How much less of a bill in my mind would I have racked up if I had just gone 6 months faster?
You saw my face. I was a little surprised to hear you say that one. I don't think I would have guessed that that was one of the lessons, and I love that you said that. It's funny because we're gonna call this episode "The Reluctant CEO," and originally when I pitched this idea to you, I pitched it as the accidental CEO, and you kinda gave me a, mm, reluctant CEO, and I liked that better because the way I framed it is that this accidentally happened. And how you talk about these lessons is that it wasn't really an accident. If I look backwards, I can actually see the sequence of how all of this came about. And I could see where I might have done
That
things
is the
differently.
beauty of hindsight.
Yeah, that is the
And
beauty of
believe me, I've
hindsight.
I've taken a look at that film reel many a time.
Like, believe me, I have tortured myself with this film for enough time. And yet what I also want to jump into is that in these lessons, as you've learned these, you've also had to articulate them as you've learned them, which means that you're going to a whole team of people and saying, "Hey, I messed up."
Yeah.
And not only is that part very challenging as a founder, as a reluctant CEO, as someone who is again very very successful and accomplished, but I also see this as a challenge in businesses because you have to do that in a way that gets everybody on board without freaking them out.
Yeah.
How'd you do that?
Did I?
I think you did.
Okay, good. I think transparency. I think the fourth lesson is simplify, which I've already talked about with Gauss law. Like, it's all in your head. And I think, especially for founders, the people who have the vision for the company, everything clicks into place up there. And it takes so much energy to share that vision with other people. And we're impatient. Now that we've made the decision, we want to move. That's me. Like, once I make the decision, I want to be gone. And I do think that, like, the refrain I have in my head, is, again, a lesson I've learned from our mutual partner, Gary Keller, that authorship is ownership, right? You have to put everything on the table. Is here's where we're going. Here's the roadmap for where we get there. What do you see? What would you add to it? You give people a chance to contribute to the vision, and those who plan the battle don't battle the plan. And so, like, I think being super transparent, like you said, screwed up. We took a wrong turn and we're now moving in the right direction. I can't remember who said it. Um, a step backwards after a wrong turn is a step in the right direction,
Yep.
which I love that saying because, like, the end of 2022, 2023 for me personally was a step backwards, but it was also a step in the right direction. I had to step back, get perspective so that we could move forward together. And you have to bring them along on that journey. So I'm encouraged that you thought I brought you along.
You totally did. Well, and I think you did a masterful job of, like I said, I was surprised to hear you say go faster because another thing that I've learned from you is I think what is challenging for the entrepreneurial type, for the entrepreneurial leader, is that you said it perfectly. We have this vision in our head, and then once we've decided, and we just want to go fast.
Yeah.
but you have to bring everybody along with you. You can't forget to gather the troops and let them know where they're marching to and why they're marching and who they're fighting. And ultimately, it has always been my tendency to move with speed, which can be great in business, very helpful. You can also railroad a lot of people and create some damage along the
You're
way.
absolutely projecting right now. So, like, I invited you onto the team, not just because I knew that you'd be a talented host for us on the podcast and it aligned with your vision, but because you're an entrepreneur and you move at speed. And I had a wise guy tell me, and I've just made it my mantra, if you're bringing someone onto the team, always rather say whoa than giddy up. It's just the right side of the equation.
Yeah.
So I brought in a speed demon named Nick's right. And to show you when maybe you're moving too fast for mere mortals, it was like my opportunity to be a coach to you. It's like, hold on, maybe we need to go back and get on the same page. Did
Well, then you're
that
dragging them
person
along all
know
the
that that
time.
was your rule for a Zoom meeting? Wink, wink, right? Maybe we need to go back and have the apology conversation. I didn't tell you the rules. So next time, and that's one of the few ways that I could coach you because you're going to do a lot of things right. And to show you when maybe you're moving too fast for mere mortals was like my opportunity to be a coach to you. It's like, hold on, maybe we need to go back and get on the same page. Did that person know that that was your rule for a Zoom meeting? Wink, wink, right? Maybe we need to go back and have the apology conversation. I didn't tell you the rules. So next time,
I'm laughing hard because Jay helped me through a leadership challenge that I was facing. That I immediately called him and said, "I think I might have messed up. think I might have done this conversation the wrong way, and I know one person who would have done it exactly right." So I came to you. So thank you for that.
that was a
And
whoa moment. That's what
it
I
was
associated.
totally a whoa moment.
Yeah.
And when you brought this vision to everyone, once you're clear, what happens if you have people who aren't on the same page? I want you to talk about that because sometimes founders do realize they have to pivot, then they start taking action, and then they bring it to the team, and the team's like, whoa, 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 that is not how we've always done things. That is not what we know. That's not what we signed up for. What happens then?
We wrote about this in the book Shift. I think if you lay out the situation, I think the people who are all in kind of raise their hands. I've been taught because I've lived through it enough times that big change often represents big opportunity. So the people who kind of have a healthy relationship with change, or they're able to make themselves comfortable with it because they see the opportunity in it, and maybe as a leader you have to point that out, and I try to make it my mantra when we're going through change. Hey, change is opportunity. The market changes, the business model changes, people who didn't think they had daylight to step up will find that daylight and they can do it. And so I think people naturally select and deselect in that moment. If they're not on board with the vision, the challenge is to get them to articulate that safely. And I can tell you I've got a spotty track record, right? Wanting them to find their connection to it. But if they don't find their own connection to where you're going, you can't find it for them. It's like you can't motivate people. So I just think that getting those answers faster is something that I could work on. Like, are you really on board with this where we're going? Because if not, like, I'm not going to like hand you a cardboard box and say pack and leave. Like, you can do it in a way that lets people feel safe, or maybe they do need a little bit more time, but you need to put parameters around that.
So we talked about a few lessons so far.
Yeah.
What else have you
So I've
learned?
got own it, the high cost of poor selection, move faster, simplify. I talked earlier about stay engaged. As a founder, even if you've hired someone to run the company, there's a minimum level of engagement unless your business is so vanilla, so generic that you could pretty much throw any leader into it and they could figure it out. Otherwise, you will lose a lot of ground during any transition, or you will fully get the job back and you won't know how to do it. So we kind of hit that ground. The last two, and I was like, it was weird that it turned out to be seven. I hate that it's seven as a writer. I want it to be something weird like 11 or 4.5 lessons, right? Because it's like seven feels whatever.
Seven feels right.
Yeah. I think that you have to be careful when you're in transition not to prioritize short term wins. Like if you're going to buy into a new big vision, go all in on it, just like you would when you're starting up. When you start up, like I kind of do expect to start profitably. I want to begin with revenue, but I don't expect it to all come at once. You expect it to come in waves. And I think it's very tempting in those moments of transition to just, oh, we should take that job and we should take that job. I was literally just coaching a friend. He asked for coaching. He did. It was invited. His business has just taken off, and while it has been going, he has been taking essentially freelance work. As a founder, he has this special skill that that's his old career. He's moving into this new thing, but his old career pays like at 10x what the new one does. And right now, when the business is just hitting the hockey stick, he got this incredible offer to do his old job.
I always feel like that's the universe, like tapping you on the shoulder
How
saying,
committed are you to the new vision?
100%.
Yeah. And I was grateful. Another friend of ours said the same thing. Is like, I just I don't know that I see how this is actually a win for where you're going. So I think if you prioritize the short-term wins, I think we would have kept the old community, which I was not proud of the value just for the revenue. Like you start making short-term decisions, and I think that ultimately you lose trust in the brand. People see you make those decisions whether you think they will or not, and then they think, oh, they're just cashing checks over there. And it's like, no, that's not. Stay trusted in the mission and keep it going.
I think what's so important about this is a lot of people get lost between a short term versus a long term win and don't know which one they're trading for. But it's simply because there's a reason why when we're doing the goal setting retreat, and there's a reason why when we set the goal, we start with casting a vision.
That's right.
You have to know where you want to go. Otherwise, how do you know if it's a short term win or a long term win?
And the vision to meet our qualifications has to align with your purpose and values. And what that gives you is a pull, right? And anybody who's aligned with those values and that mission should be pulled to that vision too, right? That's why you say like people like, oh man, I love the new direction. Let's run that direction. That's even more appealing than the old. Otherwise, you're pushing, and that's no fun at all.
And when you look up and you're making a decision as a business, it can be so hard because often you talked about going backwards.
Yeah.
And yet sometimes that's still going in the right direction. But that short term decision that you opted out of in favor of the long term goal and in favor of the long term vision cost you like quite a bit. So talk about how do you make that decision as a business owner? When is it okay to lose revenue in support of that long term vision? Or is the answer always?
Man, I want to say never, Nikki. Like if I had been a better leader before that, we wouldn't have had to be in a position where we had to tap our reserves. Like circumstances sometimes conspire where you will lose money. You never want it. You should never be okay with it. That tells you that's your P&L, right? Your income statement is telling you your business model ain't working right now. Go find the problem and fix it. And so, like, you can't just be okay with that on any level. You can be patient with it. That's the difference I'm trying to say is you can be patient in that you're not going to short circuit your brand to make sure that you're in the black that month. Right. And you also, like, at a certain point, like, I know a lot of people who are solopreneurs, like, they have to do a certain amount of whatever it is to make it work because they have to pay a mortgage that month.
Yeah.
So we were a mature business. We had almost close to seven figures in reserves when we started this transition. Like we were like, I'm a scaredy cat with reserves. Like we had tons of reserves. So we had the financial ability to get it right. And again, I would still go back and tell myself, do it faster, do it faster, do it faster. Trust your vision, do it faster.
I think that could, if you don't like your seven, that could be an eighth, though, that you having those reserves allowed you to make that responsible decision for the
Well,
business.
reserves protect you from missteps and also market mishaps. I mean, come on, I know so many businesses that barely made it through COVID. We were talking to a bookstore owner, and COVID just totally destroyed. They were in their second year of business for this really one of my favorite bookstores, and they almost went under. And it's like, who could have predicted that? But like, if you have some reserves, and then you have moxie and creativity and all those things, you can make it through. The last lesson, and this is the tactical one, and then we can go wherever you want to go. I can only keep seven ideas in my head for so long, was inspect what you expect. And that's a saying we say a lot. And when we talk about your leadership meetings, there's the trust you have that when we agree that we'll do something, that they do it. But did you actually go and spot check? And what I found was that I had not been, and not for a while. And when I would find something that was broken and I would bring it to the team and say, like, this thing is broken. This wasn't working right. This is not, doesn't feel like it in our culture. They'd say, well, we thought you knew. So what's weird is, like, as the founder or the CEO or the leader, right or wrong, everybody thinks you know everything that's going on. And that will start to hit your personal brand. Like if it's something that's out of culture and they're like, but we thought you knew and you're okay with that. Like those are the moments that actually hurt the most, when I realized that the company had strayed from our vision in different areas. And it's not anything huge, but it was like, oh man, like I hate that they thought I was okay with that. Because as soon as you see it, you're like, nope, we're stopping that. We're going to fix it right now. That is not to my standard and we're fixing it. The only way to get out of that trap, like I want to say, oh, but how can you make people feel so comfortable that they just volunteer it? I don't know the answer to that
I
yet.
was just about to ask you that question, so I'm glad you
I
said
want it to be
it.
that, but no matter how many times I could role play it and say it, I would still find another instance and it would come back to, but we thought you knew.
Right.
So there's a certain amount of that where people just assume that you know all of the stuff, the wiring that's inside the walls under the drywall. And maybe as an owner, we have to take ownership of that. And so for me, the remedy was, I've just got to inspect what I expect. I've got to spot check a lot more things. I stole this from my coach, Jordan. On our coaching calls, the last 5 minutes, he gets a recap on what we're agreeing we're going to do going forward. Well, the hack there is he records all the Zoom calls. He has the VA or one of his assistants go transcribe the last 5 minutes, so that 24 hours before our next meeting, he's like, hey, I just want to remind you that these were our topics for this week. So, and I said, why do you do that 24 hours out? Because you still got a chance to do it if you've been putting it off. I want you to win. But like when you show someone that you're paying attention, hey, last week, Nikki, you said you're going to do these three things. Are we going to be, will you be prepared to talk about them tomorrow at our meeting? Like, I'm watching, that I'm keeping track. And we all have had a boss that we worked for that wasn't, and we took advantage at some point,
Totally.
whether it
Yeah.
was in high
They're not
school.
they're not going to know if I do my homework anyway.
Right. So I'll make the outcome happen, even if it's not happening the way they want it, and everybody's good with the world. And those are the two things. Like you can have people, I've seen it in multiple businesses. Someone is raking in the cash, but the way they're doing it is not to the founder status. And so if you're only judging them on the objective outcomes and not the subjective way they do it, you may find yourself in a pickle later. So I go back, I follow my boss's mantra. Sometimes if I'm not sure we're communicating clearly, I'll say, would you mind emailing me what you believe we agreed to? And I will edit it, and that'll be what our agenda is for the first 5 minutes of the next call. Because sometimes, like, I am really clear I said it. And I know this founder, I want you to have telepathy desire is always there, but I'm sure I said it perfectly and they still don't receive it. Whose fault is that? It's mine unless I'm inspecting it. So I can go back and say, nope, how did you hear that? Let me correct that. You have a chance to fix it. So I'm just being much more thorough on when I set expectations were they received, and then following up to make sure that they were executed on. And that just takes energy. And that's the part of me that just like makes me growl. Like I don't want to have to do
I think
it.
that's everyone, Jay. I think
I
that's
know.
every leader. Because I think the talk track, and I certainly have found myself in this, which is I hire a capable person who's capable of doing great things. I don't need to check on them to go and do the great things. And yet you said it perfectly, which is in order to ensure that it gets done in the way that I wanted it to, in the way that's in integrity, in the way that's within our mission, yeah, you have to inspect it. And if you don't, it's no one's fault but your own.
This is not a license to go micromanage people either.
Yeah. I was just
Right.
about to ask, that was my follow-up question. How are you finding the balance
That's why
between,
I say spot check.
yeah, you want to give everybody
Not
space.
OCD level, right? Walk me
You're not
through the
trying to
steps
do their
again.
job.
Like, I mean, ultimately, I want to be judged on the outcomes I create. And I just want to make sure that we've got some bumper rails up. Are we staying within those? I really like, if were to bring my chief of staff up here, Carly, like every time I get into the how she should do her job, like I start censoring myself. Don't let me tell you how to do your job. Like we are at a place where she knows like what the boundaries are, and I shouldn't be in that conversation any longer. And over time, you can get almost completely out of it, but I still think you have to spot check. I've seen too many examples of people working together for 7, 8 years that because they went 100% in on the blind trust, that they were surprised. And it doesn't mean you don't trust them. It just means that everybody kind of slips up from time to time. It's your chance to help them, stay on track. Because you know how it is. Like there is a certain level of boredom with high level of success because you're doing some things again and again. And as the boss, you might be allowing yourself to cut corners where other people would not.
Yeah. You also have to watch, I think it's just contrary to the entrepreneurial behavioral style,
Yeah.
right? You started this company because you're someone who wants to build and who wants to try something new and who wants to innovate. And then you have to make peace with the fact after you become successful that like that's sort of now what you signed up for. The whatever boredom caused you to be successful, that's it. You're in it now. You can go and find other ways to innovate and be creative. I want to ask about how I think one of the bigger challenges that entrepreneurs and executives face is this exact idea that they're going to build this thing or they're going to do this job and then they're going to be done. And we see this in our industry a lot because people have this idea in the Millionaire Real Estate Agent book. There's this idea of growing your team to a seventh level,
Right.
and that one day you get to walk off into the sunset, and this business that you built, you'll just keep making money off of. You never have to touch it again. And I've yet to meet anybody who's done that successfully, unless you corrected me when we talked about it. You said unless it's like a child who takes it over or a family member or something of
Even
that sort.
then,
And even then,
I think unless you wind it down or you exit through a sale, right? And you've been a part of that, there's still a journey to go through, but at some point you get to the other side. I don't think there's a happily ever after or a retirement if you are one of the founders in a traditional sense. Maybe in a big stock company, you have no responsibilities, but you still have the ownership. But I think that there's this sense that you have to stay engaged if you truly want the business to flourish in the future, because nobody cares about your baby more than you. We've seen it. We've seen these big founders, whether it's Bill Gates or whoever, Michael Dell, that left and then stepped back in. And at a certain point, they need the founder's energy again to reinvent, what had maybe become a overly complicated business. They needed to simplify and reinvent and start a new stage of growth. And that's just what happens. It's not like, even though we have the graph in the book, right? Exponential results. It's not as linear as that appears, right? It's more steps. And sometimes you have to go down a little flight of steps to go back up the right one.
well, and I've always learned from you and Gary that you sometimes have to zoom out on that hockey stick. And that as you grow, while it might be an overarching hockey stick, if you zoom into some of those spaces, you're going to have smaller hockey sticks in places where you went down and places where you went back up. It's certainly not a perfectly upward trajectory in that moment, but over time, that's what happens.
That's what happens. That's just the reality of it. And if you embrace that and you expect it, you'll probably suffer less as you go through it, right? It's just going to happen. I want to make sure we get to the happy ending. Like the happy ending in all of this is we did get to a place where I felt like we had a clear vision. It was a much simpler model. I'm so happy that we've kind of embraced that kind of at the core of everything. We kind of always knew it was showing up, and everybody kept asking, do you do coaching? Do you do coaching? We ended up at like our foundation now starts with the coaching business, and everything leads from that. So, like, just if people are hearing all this and their lesson is, I don't want to start a business. I don't like, no, it's just a transition. And I'm role modeling how to do it wrong so that they can do it better and do it faster and less expensively than I did.
I don't know that you did it wrong. To your point, I think everyone has to go through those phases. And while most people would look at the business and what you've built over time, I don't think anyone would articulate that any of it was wrong. You've helped a lot of people, and yet we found the way to maximize our help to people because that was the mission all along. How do we help more
Impact.
people use the one thing to get to where they want to go?
Exactly. We're going to make an impact, and now we get to make an even bigger impact.
Which has been exciting to be a part of, exciting to watch, and hearing the stories of how many people we've helped through our coaching is just incredible and and you're right, an absolute happy ending, even though it didn't feel great maybe
Yeah.
at some points to get there through the process.
It was the hero's journey. You have to go through the darkest hour to get to the other side.
So somebody's listening to this right now and is you a year and a half ago, and is not in the hero is in the worst part of the hero's journey. Other than the 7 lessons, what's your advice to them?
Well, a lot of founders don't have anyone in their corner. Like you and I both have and have for years. We have coaches, not just because we're a coaching company. I had it long before I thought I would ever run a coaching company. That ultimately, you've got to have someone that's in your life that gives you perspective on your life. That's why people go to counseling, right? All those things, like someone outside of you, as my coach will say, you can't read the label from inside the box. Perspective matters. And they get to ask you questions and help you get really clear about what you're dealing with. So, like, I could tell you, like, without my coach, like, I'm not sure how long it would have taken me to go through this or how well I've navigated it. I think the biggest lesson is you don't have to do it alone. And it doesn't have to always be with a coach. Maybe you've got a co founder. You have to give yourselves permission for one person to step back and just be, as Michael Stanier, the coaching habit, would say, just kind of get a little bit curiouser. Why do you say that? What is the challenge within that? And what's the challenge within that? And you just keep someone who helps you kind of peel the onion so that you really know what's at the core. Because that's usually the first, second, or third thing you think of is almost never the core problem. You just see symptoms and you start treating symptoms and you're going to be running in circles. So someone who can be patient and help you kind of unwind that ball of yarn that's in knots until you see what you're really looking at, that's the person you need.
And a great coach is going to ask you the right questions. And then back to one of your lessons, they're going to help you build the action plan. And they're going to build it on models that actually work. So you can get out of this purgatory that you're in of wondering why it's not working. So we're gonna drop the link in the show notes to anyone who would want to connect with the one thing about coaching
Love
and
that.
about connecting with one of our coaches to help them through this period, to help them on their hero's journey. But I'm not gonna let you off easy because
Okay.
at the end of every one of these podcasts, we always ask, what's the one thing you would want listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think it was point 4, move faster. Right. The it's not information. What is the guy's name? Like if information was the answer, we'd all have six packs and be billionaires.
Hmm.
It's really about taking the information and putting it into action. And the feedback you get is from the action. So ask the question, what's my one thing? And then go do it. And that feedback will help you get better and better and better. So just don't hesitate. I think it's really easy to get caught in that analysis paralysis of asking, what is the right choice? Go make the choice you make right.
I love that. And Jay, in case anyone doesn't know where to find you, what's the best way to find you?
Well, I mean, I'm of the 8 billion people on earth, I'm the only Jay Papasan. So with
Yes, you
Google,
are.
I can't
One of a
hide,
kind.
but I would say go to the one thing that's got links to all of the stuff. But they can also find me on all the socials, and it's me or my direct team that's behind every single thing that goes up on every post up there, LinkedIn, Instagram, you name it.
Well, although you became our reluctant CEO, I'm grateful that you are the CEO. So thank you.
And I'm grateful for the journey, right? It's all about growth, and this has definitely been a big part of it.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks.